Kia ora tātou, ko te o takiti mua hau, kua hau tētahi o ngā roia mo te iwi. This video is a little explanation of where we got to with the treaty settlement and the process that we're now embarking on for the iwi to say yes or no to sign up to the treaty settlement going forward with the Crown. And so I'm going to talk you through, just by way of whakamārama, some of the key aspects of the settlement and the process to date, and we'll supplement this video and this explanation with some documents and fact sheets that will go up onto the website and be distributed throughout Hui so that you can get into the nitty-gritty of the detail and make an informed decision. Let's launch into it. First of all, as most of the iwi know, this has been a very long process for us. We've been at the negotiation table in some shape or form with the Crown for the last 20 years. Either over taku taimōna or over historic treaty settlements. The negotiation team was tasked by the Hapū at home with going down to Wellington and engaging with the Crown over that prolonged period of time to come up with an agreement that was basically the best offer that we could extract from the Crown in terms of correcting and realigning the treaty relationship as we know it. We've now done that. It's taken a long period of time, and there's been some time that we've not been at the negotiation table because things have been a little bit tense. So there's been other times we've had and experienced good faith negotiations throughout the process. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag over those 20 years, but we've now got to a point where we can deliver back a finalised product to the iwi by way of treaty settlement. And now, as always, the request of the iwi from the outset in instructing the negotiation team was that the Hapū at home, and respecting the mana of the Hapū would get to say yes or no to whether they wanted to sign up and whether they thought the Crown offer was going to be good enough. We're now at that point that we're bringing that deed of settlement back, and the Hapū can make up their minds about whether you think it's good enough. What I can say from a negotiation team point of view is we didn't get everything our own way, as is very often the case in negotiations, but we've pushed the Crown in absolutely every direction we could to extract the best agreement we can table in front of the iwi. It's up to the iwi now to decide whether that's good enough for our mokopuna. So in terms of the negotiating brief and about what the negotiations has been about, for us, this has been about fighting for our tribal territory and the sanctity of our tribal territory as it was left to us by our tipuna and as we hold it in trust for our mokopuna. As most people know, there's been a number of Crown breaches that have occurred throughout history that have impacted on our ability to hold our lands and our territories and have impacted on our population. We have tried to seek Crown accountability for that through this process. To be clear, we're not asking the Crown for any new rights. We're not asking the Crown for ownership that we don't think they have to bestow on us. We are very clear going into negotiations what our treaty rights and entitlements and responsibilities are. We know essentially what the treaty promise was that our tipuna signed up to, and we've been looking to move the Crown and give the Crown an opportunity to be honourable where they have previously been dishonourable towards our iwi for a prolonged period of time. So this has been about giving the Crown the opportunity to correct their behaviour and to realign the treaty relationship so it is healthier and it is more in line with the original treaty promise that our tipuna signed up to. There's a number of guarantees, as you know, inside the text of Te Tiriti o Waitangi that we have looked to have acknowledged throughout this negotiations process. It would be fair to say we feel like we've moved the Crown some of the way towards better alignment with that treaty relationship, and we've sought some redress to correct some of their breaches and the impact of those on our people. This treaty settlement was never going to be the delivery of complete treaty justice or the complete implementation of the treaty relationship, because that depends on us having an honourable treaty partner in Wellington that we're still looking for to some extent. We're still trying to get them there. So what happened first in the negotiations process was really brought about by the urgency by which the Crown moved their attempted raupatu on a taku taimōna. And so the taku taimōna negotiations started in 2003, 2004. They were the most immediate thing for us to deal with at that point in time because the Crown was threatening, as you know, to pass legislation that would strip away those rights. Te Whānau Apanui and Ngā Hapū negotiated in partnership with the Crown to have our rights recognised, notwithstanding that legislation, so that we could protect what we sort of refer to as our Tangaroa estate, our seaward area and our seaward boundaries of our iwi. That's been important to Apanui because we have retained 97% of our coastal land holdings, and we've wanted to make sure that the sanctity of our tribal territory and the integrity of our territory remains intact, notwithstanding what the Crown are doing in Wellington. So those negotiations kicked off first. They stopped and started for a while, depending on where the Crown were at and whether we were able to engage with them in an honourable way. And then later in the piece, as the government changed and we saw different administrations come in and out, later on in the equation came the historic treaty settlement process. Historic treaty settlements are for holding the Crown to account for what they call historic breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. So those are breaches that occurred from the signing of the treaty, so that for us in Apanui is the 14th of June 1840 to 1992. Those are what are considered by legal definition to be historic treaty breaches. Breaches that the Crown committed from 1992 to the present day are part of contemporary treaty breaches that the Crown will still need to be held to account for and will still be responsible for correcting in the future, but they are not part of this historic treaty settlement. They will come later in time. That is a different part of holding the Crown accountable for a different part in time. These historic treaty negotiations are time-bound from 1840 to 1992. So we say that on the 14th of June 1840, our tipuna who signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi secured some guarantees for us, and those guarantees should be honoured by the Crown in partnership with them as part of our constitutional relationship with the Crown. So part of those guarantees contained, particularly in Article 2, say that we should have full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of our lands, forests, fisheries, kāinga and all other taonga. We know from 1840 to 1992 that there were a number of breaches of those rights where the Crown came in, they imposed their land tenure system, they changed the way that land ownership was held, they fractioned up our tribal estate and they imposed their own laws and their own education system, their health system and various other colonial mechanisms over top of our iwi. We've said to them that as we know, the colonial method and the colonial experience has really hurt and harmed our people over successive generations, and we want them held to account for that. Not only do we want them held to account for that for the justice that our tipuna deserve, but also to realign the relationship for our mokopuna. So this is what this process has been about for us, resetting and realigning and holding the Crown responsible. We're asking the Crown to honour their treaty obligations and to recognise in law our mana and our right to exercise our mana free from the interference. You'll see from the treaty settlement that's been negotiated, we've got some of the way there. We haven't by any stretch of the imagination got all of the way there. But what we've tried to do is protect the iwi going forward by making sure that there's some clear ring fencing around our rights and entitlements. So this is acknowledged as a partial step towards treaty implementation. It's not the final resting place for our treaty relationship with the Crown. That will continue to evolve and we hope improve as we go forward. After the Crown acknowledges their breaches and apologises for them, there is then a compensation or redress package that is negotiated to go some way towards rectifying and correcting the Crown breaches. The redress packages don't get all the way there by way of total 100% compensation, and it would be difficult to do that anyway because we're talking about long-standing breaches that have occurred over multiple generations. So it is a symbolic gesture largely from the Crown to put together a redress package that says this is how we feel we can fairly compensate the iwi for the impact that we've had upon them. Inside the redress package, some things that are pure sort of compensation, like the return of certain blocks of land or financial compensation to the iwi. There's other things that are built into there that are more future looking, that talk about the realignment of the relationship going forward. So we've negotiated relationships with different Crown departments about how they will conduct themselves when they come into the iwi and how our relationship will be better going forward. It was important for Apanui always, even within a historic treaty settlement, it was important for us always to leave our mokopuna in a better position in terms of trying to realign the treaty relationship going forward so that we wouldn't just let the Crown off the hook for all of the historic wrongs that they've done, but then the very next day they continue going about breaching our rights. What we wanted to do was put some frameworks in place so that our iwi going forward would have a better treaty relationship with the Crown, and we've negotiated agreements with each of the Crown departments really that set out the protocols between us going forward. Again, it's not the totality of treaty implementation. That still is an aspirational thing that we'll work towards as an iwi, but it's a step in that direction to try and realign these relationships going forward. Just to recap, the iwi sets out our allegations against the Crown of their breaches against us. Then the Crown go through and say, yes, we admit we did certain things and we admit the impact of them, and now here we apologise and we provide some redress and some compensation for that. What happens then is that's drawn up into this deed of settlement, and we deliver it back to the iwi to say, do you agree to that? Do you agree that the setting out of your history and then the Crown admission of their wrongs and their apology for it, plus the compensation, do you agree that is a fair exchange for the settling of all of your claims against the Crown from 1840 to 1992? That effectively is the decision in front of the iwi now as we come into this ratification process. And ratification is just a flash legal way of saying consent. Do you give consent for this? I'm going to break down the deed of settlement and so you can understand the structure of it. And like I said, there'll be supplementary documents and presentations and things like that, fact sheets on the website so people can unpack it a bit more. But the structure of the deed of settlement is set out so that we've got a background section, which is the Apanui story, really, like how we came to be as Te Whānau Apanui, how we became an iwi under the name Te Whānau Apanui, where we came from, what our ancestry is, and sets out the boundaries of our tribal territory, mai pōtikirua ki te taumata o Apanui, from inland on the Raukumara boundary with Ngāti Porou and pushed out to our seaward boundary. So the background section sets out the Apanui story in terms of who are Te Whānau Apanui. Now, it's not our complete encyclopedia of our entire Waiki wānanga. That's for us outside of these negotiations to maintain within our iwi and our own tribal narrative. This is a summary version of that inside the background section. The background section is then followed by the historical account. So the historical account is basically like takes it from the background section that Apanui were possessed of their mana and tapu and living in our own rangatiratanga in 1840. The Crown came along and we signed this Tiriti o Waitangi, this kawanata tapu with the Crown, and then we start talking through the historical account about what went right and what went wrong with that relationship. You'll see from the text inside the historical account that a lot more went wrong with it than went right with it, but that sets out the historical account as agreed wording with the Crown, so it's really powerful for us and for our mokopuna. It's written in strong language because they were strong breaches against our people and affected not just our land holdings, not just our taiao, but affected the psyche of our people and our understanding of ourselves. So that's all layered into the historical account. The important thing about that being agreed text with the Crown is that our iwi and our mokopuna, after the signing of this deed of settlement, if the iwi say yes to it, are able to rely on that historical account and say, hey, you admitted here this is what happened. You agreed to the wording that this is a fair and accurate representation of the joint history between us. So it becomes a powerful kind of curriculum piece for us as an iwi. Following on from the historical account is what we call the sovereignty statements. Now, for those of you who have been through treaty settlement processes with other iwi or other places that you whakapapa to, these sovereignty statements are a point of difference inside the Apanui settlement that are not seen in other treaty settlements yet. So the sovereignty statements, what we've wanted to do is right up front in the deed of settlement, have an acknowledgement that there are constitutional issues outstanding between Apanui and the Crown. So the settling of our historic treaty claims against the Crown is not enough to turn around and then say, well, then Apanui agree to Crown sovereignty, or Apanui then now agree to the constitutional setup of Aotearoa the way it currently exists. The sovereignty statements preserve to Apanui the fact that we have our own constitutional expectations in regards to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and what it protected for us in our mokopuna. And inside a treaty settlement process in Aotearoa, those things have never really been on the table for the Crown to unpack and have the maturity really to undertake a full constitutional discussion. The Crown controlled the treaty settlements process. It's unilaterally controlled by the government. And so there's only certain things that are on the table. Constitutional discussions have never been on the table as part of a treaty settlement process. Notwithstanding that, Apanui didn't feel like we could go forward with developing and drafting up a deed of settlement for the iwi that didn't explicitly preserve out our right to our own sovereignty, our right to our own rangatiratanga, and our challenge to the Crown in terms of their assertion that they are the sole sovereigns in this country. If we remained silent on that, the risk for us was that our signing up to a treaty settlement and our negotiated agreements with different Crown departments going forward would be interpreted or misconstrued by people as Apanui then agreeing to the way that the Crown currently implementing treaty partnership. And we've said very clearly to the Crown from the very outset of negotiations and all the way through that we will not agree to that. We can't agree to that. And so we've explicitly drafted in these sovereignty statements to ensure that there can be no mistake or misinterpretation about that. And those are really important for us to have anchored into the deed of settlement. What follows on from the sovereignty statements is then the Crown acknowledgements. So that's where the Crown go through the historical account and admit to the bits that they concede that they've breached, where they admit that they have breached certain things. And where possible, we've tried to get the Crown to acknowledge the impact of those breaches. They haven't gone all the way there on impact, but we know that their breaches of their treaty obligations to us have had intergenerational impacts on our people and our land and our taia. Particularly you look at the raukumara and the state of our rivers and those sorts of things. So the Crown acknowledgements come next in the deed of settlement, then the Crown apology, then the redress package. And the redress compensation package is split into certain categories. There's part of that is about a financial compensation and cash that will form part of this treaty settlement. There's another section about whenua properties that are being returned to the iwi. So some of those are reserve lands, some of those are surplus lands. Some of those are lands the Crown should never have had their hands on in the first place. We've negotiated those to be returned back to the iwi. When they come back to the iwi through the treaty settlement process, they will, in almost all cases, be returned from an iwi level down to the hapū level, because each of those properties exist obviously within a hapū estate. And in Apanui, the mana of the hapū is sacrosanct, so those pass through the iwi structure, and in nearly all of the cases they are returned to the hapū on the ground. Inside the redress package is also a set of legal tools and status acknowledgements, where those are legal mechanisms whereby, say for example, Apanui now is acknowledged on regional maps as having a rohe moana. Apanui's territory is acknowledged on formal planning documents going forward. So those people making decisions or exercising Crown authority within the tribal territory or in places that impact on the tribal territory will then run up against the legal status where our mana has been acknowledged, and that will require certain protocols to occur before people just sort of come willy-nilly into our tribal territory. So that's been largely unregulated to date, and Crown agents, whether it be local government or central government, have sort of come in on the back of their statutory warrants and said, we've got the authority, we're the fisheries officers, we're the people setting up the roadways. And that's kind of been a unilateral authority trying to come into Apanui without any real protocols or kawa or rules of engagement. The legal tools and status parts of the redress package look to specifically realign that, so that people coming into our tribal territory do it in a way that's negotiated and agreed with us. And then following on from that are longer term agreements with different Crown departments. So this is taking the Crown as this juggernaut of colonial authority, and as it splits its power, it's to be exercised by various government departments. So it might be Ministry of Education, might be Ministry for the Environment, might be Transit New Zealand, might be those that are doing the fishing regulations and those sorts of things. There's now long-term agreements being negotiated between the mana of the Hapū of Apanui and the Crown to realign how those people carry out their work programs, to either include us or exclude us, or to have a more functional relationship with us going forward. So that's the structure of the Deed of Settlement. Background section, historical account, sovereignty statements, followed by the Crown acknowledgements, the Crown apology, and then the redress package. That totally forms the text of the Deed of Settlement, and that is what Apanui as a population now, as an iwi population, are being asked to vote on to ensure that this is an Apanui look and feel and speaks to Apanui, and within a framework that we identify with and understand. It's grouped around several identifying kaupapa. So those are the principles that are woven right throughout this Deed of Settlement. Breaking that down first of all is Toitu Te Mana Motuhake, and this is the part of the Deed of Settlement where Apanui expressly preserves our rangatiratanga and our mana motuhake, our sovereignty, to ourselves, and doesn't cede it or concede it along the way. So we don't acknowledge that that's ever been surrendered to the Crown. So the position of Te Whānau Apanui is that Apanui have never ceded sovereignty, and that the Crown's assertion and exercise of sovereign authority in and of itself is a breach of the treaty. The issue of Crown sovereignty obviously is a major constitutional issue for Aotearoa. It's a subject of a kaupapa inquiry before the Waitangi Tribunal. There hasn't really been the opportunity to unpack that and wrestle with it within the treaty settlements process, because the Crown set the parameters for that treaty settlement process, and constitutional issues have never been up for discussion. But that's of vital importance to us as an iwi, because it's about our nationhood. It's about our ability to be independent and continue in our independence going forward. So Apanui, of course, have an ongoing claim to sovereignty and to the exercise of our rangatiratanga, to ensure that there can't be any mischief read into this agreement that we, say for example, have surrendered or conceded that the Crown have a right to be sovereign over top of our mana and the mana of our mokopuna. We have explicitly put into this Deed of Settlement wording that preserves the Apanui position on mana motuhake. So the deed records that Apanui consider that they are a sovereign nation who do not cede sovereignty to the Crown and have not ever ceded sovereignty to the Crown. So the deed explicitly records that Whānau Apanui consider that we are a sovereign nation who do not cede sovereignty to the Crown when we signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi on the 14th of June 1840 in Te Kaha, and that we retain our sovereignty to today. It's been uninterrupted by our treaty relationship with the Crown. The Crown, of course, considers that their sovereignty was established, they say, by a process of constitutional and jurisdictional steps. Those are somewhat vague to us and they're not set out, but it's the basis for the Crown claim of sovereignty, and that they say that their sovereignty is intact. We, of course, challenge that. We'll continue to challenge that. Most importantly, those two positions are not reconciled by this Deed of Settlement. We're not giving up an inch on that, and the Crown's not really giving any space on that either. But also, we're not settling that as part of this Deed of Settlement. We're keeping the debate for that live. So the wording inside the deed is that nothing in the deed can be interpreted as relinquishing or extinguishing the Te Whānau Apanui claim to ongoing mana, rangatiratanga or sovereignty, or prevent Te Whānau Apanui raising its views about sovereignty with the Crown in the future. That's to prevent mischief, and to give our mokopuna a very clear indication that those issues are still live. When it comes to the sovereignty statements, like I've said, these are a little bit unique to the Apanui settlement. I'm going to read in full the Te Whānau Apanui sovereignty statement so you can see what's written inside the deed and what we've tried to be explicit about preserving. So the Te Whānau Apanui sovereignty statement reads, the iwi is an indigenous nation. They have ongoing and enduring mana, rangatiratanga and sovereignty over the territory of Te Whānau Apanui. Te Whānau Apanui rely on inherent sovereign authority and jurisdiction acquired when the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui settled their territory in accordance with tikanga and consistent with the accepted international law standards. This sovereignty has never been taken, ceded, voluntarily relinquished or acquired in any other way by a foreign power or government, including the Crown. Accordingly, Te Whānau Apanui have never considered and have consistently objected to the claim by the Crown that the treaty they signed on 14 June 1840 was a treaty of cession. Further, the treaty they signed protected Whānau Apanui's territorial integrity and rangatiratanga. Te Whānau Apanui's nationhood and rangatiratanga survived the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Te Whānau Apanui rely on their indigenous law, history, expert findings of the Waitangi Tribunal and international law, particularly the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as reaffirming that they are sovereign in their own right and entitled to the full measure of their Indigenous and treaty-protected rights as a matter of law and fact. So that's the Apanui sovereignty statement that's right at the front end of this deed of settlement, to ensure that we're properly contextualising what it is we're doing in this treaty settlement and being clear about what it is we're not doing as part of the treaty settlement. So from there it moves on to the section Toitu Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and this is the section that houses the historical account, that houses the Crown acknowledgements, the Crown apology. So the historical account really includes reference to the fact that Whānau Apanui, before the signing of Te Tiriti, we were possessed of our own rangatiratanga. We weren't sitting on the beach in Te Kaha waiting for the Crown or anyone else to come and save us from ourselves or to complete us as people. We were already a complete functional nation with our own tribal government and tribal laws in place. So the historical account makes reference to the fact that at the time that the British Crown first came to New Zealand and on the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that was the state of play. And we're saying we've maintained that rangatiratanga all the way through. We've never relinquished that. The signing of the treaty didn't sign that over to any foreign power. So we acknowledge that we had full systems of self-government and were in complete control of our own affairs at 1840. We acknowledge Te Tiriti o Waitangi sets out a framework for the relationship between our Hapū, the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui, in their sovereign capacities, and the British Crown at that point. Although we had little contact with the Crown at the beginning of the treaty relationship, they were busy in Wellington exercising authority that was contrary to the agreements that they had made with our people. And then we talk about Te Turekai Whenua, the importation of a new land regime for this country that then took our customary ways of holding land and converted them into land titles and land shares and set up the native land court system and really disrupted and undermined and dismantled our tribal way of holding land and authority and impacted on our collectives and the way that we socially organised. So those things are all captured in the historical account. It makes for some gruesome reading at times. It talks through in the historical account about the Crown's land purchases and some of the dealings that went on that were in the Crown's mind less than ideal, but in our mind quite devious and undermining that relationship that we were supposed to have protected by Article 2 of the treaty. We talk about Te Patu Wairua, Te Takahi Tapu, and how the Crown's acts and omissions impacted on our socio-economic justice and well-being systems that we had set up within the iwi, and resulted really in the situation where Apanui have been disadvantaged both on our own lands and then through the urbanisation part of colonisation that then followed through the disconnection and disenfranchisement of our people. The historical account also acknowledges specific wrongdoing in regards to certain things that the Crown did. For example, the maintenance or substandard provision of infrastructure into the area in ways that put our people at ongoing risk. And we've sort of talked in that historical account about the imbalance of the treaty relationship that Te Whānau Apanui and its Hapū have always tried to exercise honourably our treaty relationship and have contributed to this nation and contributed to the wider kind of New Zealand politic, including those of our iwi that were engaged in the war efforts and other contributions into the national infrastructure, and how that imbalance has come to pass where we have been good honourable treaty partners, but the Crown in a reciprocal way have not done that. From there, Toitu Te Tiriti o Waitangi section moves into the Crown acknowledgements. Like I said before, this is where the Crown go through all of the alleged breaches that we've put in front of them and pick out those of the alleged breaches that they will cough to, that they'll acknowledge. It hasn't been the whole suite of allegations against them that they've been prepared to admit. Some of that is not because there's no evidence for it. Some of that's because it reflects the politics of the day. And there's certain things that the Crown, in their capacity as coloniser, are not able to admit because it attacks sort of the heart of their colonial fictions. So they sit out there. We've still put them there as our allegations against the Crown, and we've owned those statements. But where the Crown have been able to meet us, they've made specific acknowledgements. I'm going to read through those acknowledgements so that you can get the flavour of them, but it's also very important, again, part of our ongoing iwi story, to ensure that where the Crown acknowledges their wrongdoing and their impact on our people over multiple generations, that's not just signed away and put on a shelf somewhere and collect dust and nobody see it again. This is probably the crux of the deed of settlement. The redress package and the compensation and the structural setup that follows is actually by the by. This is the acknowledgement where the Crown says they finally, for once, in black and white and in writing, instead of the colonial gaslighting we've had for 184 years, they finally say, we admit we've done things wrong in regards to the rangatiratanga of this iwi, and it's impacted on them, it's impacted on their territory, and it's impacted on their mokopuna. And that's why the acknowledgements are probably the most weighty part of the deed of settlement. So I'm going to read through each of them. It'll get a bit heavy, but hang in there because this is the weighty bit. So the Crown makes a series of acknowledgements, including that Te Whānau Apanui has upheld its obligations as a treaty partner and tried over many years to have the Crown uphold their obligations under the treaty. So it talks of our efforts to continue to hold the Crown to account, because this is not the first time we've been to the table with the Crown to remind them of their treaty obligations. So this acknowledges the long journey, not just of the current negotiation team, which has actually been a flash of history, a small blink of an eye compared to the 184 odd years our tipuna have tried to hold this government to account also. The acknowledgements make reference to the fact that Apanui has upheld its treaty obligations. We have been honourable treaty partners. The acknowledgements talk of the tino rangatiratanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui, and that acts and omissions of the Crown have undermined the tino rangatiratanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui. This is the first time this is going to appear in print in the history of our nation, that the Crown actually admit that they have undermined their laws, their policies, their actions and omissions have undermined and have sought in some places to undermine our rangatiratanga. There's acknowledgement that the Crown's assimilationist policies negatively impacted on the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui. As we know, that effort to have us all as one New Zealand, which really meant put down your Apanuitanga, put down your rangatiratanga and come under Crown authority. They've admitted that the assimilation policies have negatively impacted on our Hapū. The Crown acknowledged their acts and omissions undermined the tikanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui in relation to our lands and our territories, and that has caused or contributed to the alienation of some of those lands and territories, and has contributed to our alienation from those lands and territories, so it's interrupted that relationship. The Crown acknowledge and admit that they did not consult with Te Whānau Apanui before introducing native land laws in the 1860s, and that the operation and impact of those laws contributed to the erosion of our Hapū tribal structures. This is a key acknowledgement, because on the back, sometimes the Crown and the history books have colonisation reduced to a series of transactions that where they look to correct certain transactions that went wrong over certain bits of land, then they say they've pieced back together an honourable relationship. That is not the case. That's not factually correct. What we have tried to get the Crown to acknowledge, and in that Crown acknowledgement, they've got some of the way there, is to say, not only did your landlords come in and fragment up the land and trigger a series of transactions that then impacted on us, the part of the impact of that, knowingly or not, but we've obviously said to the Crown, you knew what you were doing because it was designed this way, contributed to the erosion of Te Whānau Apanui Hapū tribal structures. So they look to destabilise our self-government by the introduction of foreign land laws that then fragmented up our collectives and the way we socially organised ourselves. Once you start undermining that, for a people that organise themselves collectively, you then are able to ride all of the colonial violence that comes by way of law and policy on the back of that, because you've weakened the tribal structures and the tribal governmental structures that supported us. So that acknowledgement is really important inside the Deed of Settlement. There's an acknowledgement from the Crown that they were aware that the crossing of the Motu was dangerous, and they had been, in fact, petitioned by Apanui to have a school in Maraenui for a period of time. The acknowledgement note that they were aware that the crossing of the Motu was potentially dangerous and of the tragic loss of life that occurred, and that it discriminated against Te Whānau Apanui when it declined to fund a bridge over the Motu River to make it safe. The reason that they declined that infrastructure investment was because Te Whānau Apanui would not open our lands up to European settlement. It was a punishment from the Crown upon us as an iwi because we wouldn't allow foreigners to come into our lands. We wouldn't surrender our lands up for European settlement. So they then continued a situation where our children were at risk because they declined the funding for a safe bridge over the Motu, specifically for that reason. So that acknowledgement, again, this is the first time in history that the Crown have actually acknowledged that kino intention of theirs. Not just that they didn't have the money, not just that they couldn't invest in that area because they had other priorities, but that there was a punitive or punishment element to the reason that they didn't invest in that safe infrastructure. The Crown acknowledged also the degradation of the Raukumara ranges and the sedimentation that has impacted on our awa, basically the desecration of our taiao, and what we are now fighting back with today with the Raukumara Restoration Project. The Crown acknowledged inside the Deed of Settlement their contribution to that, which has been huge in terms of the introduction of pest species and the mismanagement of that area. The acknowledgements, Crown acknowledgements, also acknowledge the impact of native schools to promote the assimilation of Te Whānau Apanui citizens. So to promote the assimilation of our mokopuna over to a colonial way of thinking, the impact of the native schools regime. So schools were required, as we know, to speak and teach in English at the time, and Whānau Apanui children, like many Māori mokopuna around the country, were punished for speaking their own language. There's an acknowledgement in there that the Crown failed to actively protect te reo rangatira and encourage its use. We know, of course, the impact of that on an Indigenous nation. When you take from them their ability to speak in their own language, means that they cannot access all of the mātauranga that comes in on the back of that language. So it's really the assimilationist policies that came through that native school regime have been a key tool in colonising our people, because they're about the colonisation of the mind and the replacement of our tribal Indigenous truths for a colonial narrative. So there's an acknowledgement in there around the impact of native schools. There's a specific Crown acknowledgement in regards to Apanui suffering socio and economic deprivation for far too long in a way that has impacted on our people. So Whānau Apanui have suffered socio-economic deprivation for far too long, and Apanui were not consulted about Crown policies that might have detrimental impact to their health, education, economic development and cultural practices. This is not unknown to us. Largely the government in Wellington have carried on unilaterally making decisions for long periods of time and have sought not the consent of our people. Sometimes they've gone round in these policy roadshows, as we know, and reduced our right to give consent or have full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of our territories. They've reduced that to the right to be consulted sometimes So we've got a Crown acknowledgement in there that there's been an impact in terms of socio-economic deprivation, but also the unilateral nature in which the Crown have continued to make decisions that impact on us without our consent. There's an acknowledgement that the Crown encouraged Te Whānau Apanui to leave our rohe, to alienate themselves from their own tribal lands. So leave the rohe, and this has impeded intergenerational transmission of mātauranga and eroded the cohesion of our iwi and resulted in disconnection of whole generations of our mokopuna to our tribal base and what used to be a source of strength for us in terms of our rangatiratanga, but now not connected because of the Crown's interference in our tribal self-government. There's an acknowledgement by the Crown that Whānau Apanui made significant contributions to the development of New Zealand, and despite Crown acts and omissions, Apanui have remained resilient and retained our tino rangatiratanga, tribal identity, mana motuhake to the present day. So there's a meaty chunk of those acknowledgements fleshed out in full in the Deed of Settlement, and that follows on into the apology where the Crown then turn around and say, having admitted that we did all of those things, here's an apology from us for doing those things to your iwi. I'm going to read the Crown apology out word for word the way it's set out in the deed so that you can hear it. The Crown apologises to the tūpuna, the rangatira, the kaumātua, the tamariki and mokopuna of Te Whānau Apanui. The Crown states, before you signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Whānau Apanui exercised tino rangatiratanga over your affairs. The Crown guaranteed in Te Tiriti o Waitangi that Te Whānau Apanui would retain tino rangatiratanga. Instead, the Crown has promoted laws and policies that have undermined Te Whānau Apanui, tino rangatiratanga, and this has wrought immense harm on your iwi. For this, the Crown sincerely apologises. The Crown deeply regrets that its policies to colonise and assimilate Māori into European culture have caused prejudice to generations of Te Whānau Apanui. Crown policies have contributed to the socio-economic marginalisation of too many Te Whānau Apanui and the disconnection of Te Whānau Apanui from mātauranga Māori and your taonga te reo Māori. For this, the Crown profoundly apologises. The Crown apologises for its breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which has tarnished its honour and brought great harm to Te Whānau Apanui. The Crown is deeply sorry for its failures to protect the tamariki of Te Whānau Apanui, the times it has discriminated against Te Whānau Apanui, and the disconnection Te Whānau Apanui have suffered from some important parts of your whenua. The Crown pays tribute to Te Whānau Apanui resilience during your long struggle for justice and recognises the contribution of Te Whānau Apanui have made to the development of New Zealand and the nation's defence. The Crown also recognises the prominence of the descendants of Apanui Ringamutu today in many spheres of New Zealand life, including politics, law, sport and visual and performing arts. The Crown sees the settlement we signed today as heralding a new beginning for the partnership between Te Whānau Apanui and the Crown based on good faith, mutual respect and Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its principles. So the commitment then follows on from the Crown to say that the Crown and Te Whānau Apanui agree that Te Tiriti o Waitangi lays an important foundation for the conduct of present and ongoing relationship between us and acknowledges that we look forward to building an enduring relationship of mutual trust, cooperation based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So that's still to come, still to eventuate, but the acknowledgement about the commitment to realign what has been an abusive and dysfunctional relationship into something healthier and more what was envisaged by the original treaty promise. That commitment going forward is captured inside the Deed of Settlement as well. I'm going to break down the part of the Deed of Settlement entitled Toi Tu Te Aoturoa. The Te Aoturoa framework is a framework that's been developed as part of these settlement negotiations. It contains an extensive iwi-led set of arrangements for managing the natural resources within the Te Whānau Apanui rohe. The framework involves the Bay of Plenty Regional Council and the Opotiki District Council and the Gisborne District Council, as well as Central Crown agencies. So the key elements of the Te Aoturoa framework are that there's a statement of Apanui core values at the beginning of the Toi Tu Te Aoturoa section. Those values include toitu te manatua, toitu te Aotearoa, toitu te mana o Ngā Hapū, toitu te oranga whānui, o Ngā Whānau, toitu te tiriti o Waitangi. So each of those principles of ours is unpacked and articulated in a way that reflect an Apanui commitment to our values, and then those values are then integrated into the framework so that any question of interpretation or implementation of the Te Aotearoa framework is then done in accordance with those values. From there's a local authority agreement which is entered into where Apanui on the one side, and then the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, the Gisborne District Council and the Apanui District Council. The purpose of that agreement is to enable collaborative working relationships and provide a framework by which tribal laws, tikanga and our unique cultural spiritual system is taken into account and able to be related and reflected inside those relationships. As we know, with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, the Apanui District Council and Gisborne District Council, they've all had kind of reach or footprint, at least on paper, into the Apanui territory. We're now saying to them, when you come into the Whānau Apanui territory, we want you to conduct yourselves in accordance with this local authority agreement, which sets out the protocols, relationship protocols between us. So core principles underpinning that local authority agreement are respect for the mana of our hapū, promotion of the well-being of Te Aotearoa, because our taiao's in a state, as we know, consistency with Te Whānau Apanui values for things that are going on inside our territory, and respect for Te Tiriti o Waitangi itself. So the agreement sets out the relationship sort of component whereby going forward we will have not only a voice at the table but have the right to have our values and our worldview taken into account in terms of the administration of our territory, and it's a step geared towards the recognition of the mana of our hapū. So the next part of the Toitu Te Aotearoa framework is the Te Whānau Apanui Rohe document. That Rohe document is where we express our views on respecting the mana and tapu of the taiao, and we put those into a statement that then is reflected back to the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, so that regional policy statements need to reflect that and have that application within the Te Whānau Apanui Rohe. Those regional policy statements, and therefore the regional planning documents that come off them, now must be consistent with the Te Whānau Apanui Rohe statement. So that we need to write that up as an iwi and strategize that, and then once that's put in place, the regional policy statements and planning documents will need to be consistent with that document. So it's a way to ensure that our worldview is overlaid over the tribal territory, so that those people coming in to exercise any sort of authority or powers within that space are doing so in accordance with our worldview and our values. The next part of the Te Aotearoa framework are the participation arrangements, where resource consents that are applied for within the Te Whānau Apanui Rohe, they must be publicly notified, and the governance structure within Apanui can appoint qualified commissioners into the panels that make decisions on resource consents. So it's a way, again, to make sure we've got representation, we've got voice, and we've got standing inside consenting processes that would impact inside our rohe. Without those arrangements, one, there's a whole lot going through as non-notified, so we're not even coming up, they're not coming up on our radar, and we're not coming up on theirs. Now this requires that those matters must be publicly notified, and that Te Whānau Apanui will have the right to have a qualified commissioner into the consenting panel so that our views are taken into account. These arrangements inside the deed in relation to wai Māori, so freshwater arrangements, whereby hapū representatives form a collective to prepare freshwater management plans. Again, it's our way of setting our own parameters for the administration of the natural world. I know we don't talk about it in a property sense, but the natural world and the freshwater estate within our tribal territory. So each of the hapū are into that freshwater management group. They will then set objectives for the management plan of freshwater, objectives about flows, about limit around the big catchments that are in Apanui, particularly around our big rivers. The group, that management group, will also assess and report on any resource consent applications that are lodged, and they really play a leading role for the iwi in the freshwater management across the Rohe after this agreement. They will be guided and in fact really directed by the Hapū and the mana of the Hapū, articulating and directing to them your respective priorities around your river catchments. So it might be those Hapū that are associated and border the Motu River will have obviously strong perspectives on the way that river and that catchment is administered and managed. That will be separate and different from the way that the Hapū that border the Raukokore River might want their river and water table and water catchment administered. So the Hapū will feed that into this representative freshwater management group who will then administer that on behalf. But it is very much a mechanism that is supposed to reflect the mana of the Hapū speaking into decision making. Okay, so inside the Te Aotearoa framework is also reference to Ngā Awa, and there's a Crown acknowledgement about the connection and relationship of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui to the rivers within our respective territory. They acknowledge that we've got kaitiaki responsibilities and they exist independently of legal ownership of the riverbeds or the lands adjoining them. Like, our responsibilities exist in our tikanga and our ture, whether or not the legal ownership of the Crown reflects that. So the arrangements in regards to the rivers reflect that we've got a distinct relationship anchored in our own tikanga, our own law, and the Crown commits within that framework to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and to better recognise the rights and interests of the Hapū to fresh water, including the expression of our kaitiakitanga and rangatiratanga in relation to water bodies within our territory. The deed doesn't prevent Hapū from pursuing claims as the customary Aboriginal title in relation to the riverbeds or to water. Those things we can still make those claims going forward. A big chunky part of the Te Aotearoa framework is the redress that has been negotiated in regards to the raukumara. So the raukumara, inland raukumara, as opposed to the raukumara at sea, the inland raukumara that goes up to the watershed and forms our border with Ngāti Porou and others. At the arrangements in regards to the raukumara, a bespoke mechanism has had to be developed because the raukumara is in such a state of crisis that, one, we can't allow it to be mismanaged the way it's been mismanaged, but also ourselves and Ngāti Porou, obviously in the full exercise of our mana and our kaitiakitanga, want to be involved and want to strategically lead the work to restore the raukumara. So because the raukumara forest is in a critical condition, it's almost reached a state of forest collapse. That's been recognised really early in the negotiations, and the immediate need to improve that situation has been in the forefront of. So the settlement establishes a new raukumara joint body, and the members are appointed by Te Whānau Apanui Ngāti Porou and the Director General of Conservation. We get 2 members each. That's so we can't get outvoted by the Crown when we're trying to make decisions in the best interest of the taiao. The functions of that group, of that raukumara joint body, are to prepare a new raukumara conservation management strategy over the raukumara in the wider East Cape. So there will now be, where the raukumara and some of Apanui lands previously have been captured under either the Bay of Plenty Conservation Management Strategy or the East Coast Hawke's Bay Conservation Management Strategy. Now there will be a bespoke conservation management strategy, what we call a CMS, for the raukumara and the wider East Cape, and that will have ourselves, Ngāti Porou and the Crown, all working in collaboration to make decisions as to what goes into that conservation management strategy. That governance group will also perform functions in relation to the preparation and approval of conservation management plans over the raukumara. So they kind of work in a government policy way, in a cascading way. So you have a CMS, a conservation management strategy, and then from that drops down into a conservation management plan. The bottom line of this redress is we've sought to have Te Whānau Apanui and Ngā Hapū equitably represented in each of those phases, and really for the principles underpinning the raukumara and the restoration of the raukumara to reflect our tikanga and the way that we understand our taiao, because that's about the restoration of balance and the restoration of the mauri of the raukumara in a way that's abundant and life-supporting, as opposed to the resource management mindset that looks to see how much you can exploit a resource before it collapses, and then they set targets and limits back from the collapse point. We're saying for the raukumara, we know it's already on the brink of collapse, but also our worldview would not manage things that way. Our worldview was less about resource management and extraction and more about balance and mauri and about respect between tuakana and Tēnā. So we're looking to have that embedded as a distinct flavour for the management of the raukumara as its own conservation management strategy area. The next bit of the toitu te Aotearoa part of the framework is in relation to the taku taumona. The taku taumona, as you know, has been on a much longer discussion with the Crown, and so there was a 2008 heads of agreement that was negotiated between Apanui and the Crown. And then, as we know, the Crown put out a drilling permit for the Raukumara Basin, and we as an iwi got stroppy about that and said, so we're not sitting at the table with you because you're being dishonourable and you're giving out mining permits in the office next door while you're negotiating with us. So we had got to the point with the Crown that we had signed a heads of agreement with them in 2008. By 2010 they were in breach of even the good faith that underpinned that. So we parked it up and said, we'll double back round for that when you're ready and when we're ready to do that. This historic treaty settlement has been a way to pull in a lot of the negotiated aspects of the 2008 taku taumona agreement between the iwi and the Crown and reliven them and get a refreshed commitment to them. But the key aspects for us again are about the reflection of the mana of the Hapū in regards to their own distinct taku taumona, so that we are not going cap in hand to the Crown or to any government official to ask them permission to exercise our own mana in our own territory. So that's number one. There are conservation processes built into that taku taumona framework where, say for conservation purposes, where people are going for concessions and consents, there needs to be reference to Hapū consent being obtained in advance of an application being pushed through those processes. So for example, in relation to concession applications, Hapū consent must be obtained before an application, say for example to possess a marine mammal or the creation of a marine mammal sanctuary or things like that. Where those formal concession processes exist in law, proposed bylaws you can use to restrict and prohibit commercial, recreational, customary fishing activity to ensure sustainability. You can put rāhui on places. You can establish and manage our pātaka more consistently with our tikanga. Te Whānau Apanui's applications for customary marine title under the Marine and Coastal Area Act not extinguished or dealt with or disposed of by this deed of settlement. We will continue to have a process whereby our claim to customary marine title will continue, and once their title is recognised, the mechanisms will sort of kick in to put strength behind that title. So just by way of reminder, Te Whānau Apanui has applied for one customary marine title that spans our entire tribal territory from Pōtikirua to Te Taumata Apanui. We've taken a one application approach since the beginning of negotiations in 2003 so that our entire tribal territory maintains its integrity. From the border at Pōtikirua with Ngā Hapū and right round to our border with Ngāitai. That's to be captured, and the plan has always been to have that captured under one customary marine title rather than have bitsy titles reflecting different parts where we assert mana. That's happened in some other rohe and some other iwi, and what happens is you create a patchwork quilt of legal protections that come on and off depending on where you're standing. We didn't want that as a legal solution for Apanui, because we've taken the perspective once you drive into Apanui borders or come in by way of the seaward boundary, that there should just be one blanket clear law relating to the customary marine title that overlays that area, and that marine title then is seen as an iwi territory marine title that has then got hapū boundaries contained within that customary marine title. But again, that's consistent with the way that we have traditionally held our taku taimona in regards to the mana of the hapū being sacrosanct. So mana in regards to the coastal marine area has never been exercised in our territory by land block or by any smaller subset of a hapū. The hapū were the autonomous governing collectives, and that's where we've tried to reflect the sanctity of that mana within the approach to the taku taimona. So that one application for the iwi is something that the iwi has endorsed since the beginning of negotiations in 2003 and continues to endorse as we go forward. It will now be reflected in the forward-looking documentation inside the Deed of Settlement. So the part of the deed that is under the heading Toitu Te Whenua is, one, recognises that whenua is important to us. It's a basic proviso, and we've anchored that into the Toitu Te Whenua aspect of the settlement. And then there's sites to be returned, like land to be returned to Apanui as part of the redress. Now, Apanui didn't suffer a lot of raupatu in regards to land because of the lack of access and the remoteness of our tribal territory. And so we don't have a lot of land for the Crown to give back, because we've maintained the majority of our tribal lands inside our hapū land holdings. But there are 12 sites to be returned to Te Whānau Apanui as part of a cultural redress package. Like I said, they relate to, or each bit of land is obviously within a hapū territory, so they relate to each of the hapū. Some sites will transfer back in their totality, like fee simple title, so that they come back unencumbered and with the highest type of colonial title you can get over a piece of land. There's other sites that will come back with some conditions attached, and that's not through lack of trying. We've tried to get all the conditions taken off as much as possible, but we've also taken the position that in the circumstances we haven't been able to get all the conditions taken off, it's better to get the ownership of the land returned to the hapū, and we'll work on the conditions over a longer period of time. I should mention that the way that sites are being returned often reflects the way that they were confiscated or taken or acquired in the first place, which piece of legislation, whether it be under the Preservation of Scenery Act, whether it be under the Conservation Act, those sorts of things. So sometimes that's created different hurdles for how they're returned, so they're coming back in a little bit different way each time. Sites that are transferring back to Te Whānau Apanui as scenic reserves are the sites known as Hawaii Site A and Tokata. Sites that are returning to Whānau Apanui as recreational reserves are Maraitai, or Mile Bay, Oroaiti Beach, Tāheke, and what is known as the Waiho Beach Recreational Reserve. Those recreational reserves will have some conditions around public access continuing attached to them. The hapū that are affected have normally been informed of that along the way. Sites transferring to Te Whānau Apanui as historic reserves include what is known as Whanarua Bay Site B. Sites that are transferring to Te Whānau Apanui as local purpose reserves, Whangaprawa Beach property, so there's a stretch at Whangaprawa along the beach, and what is known as Hawaii Site B. Sites that are transferring to Te Whānau Apanui in fee simple, so in total full ownership without conditions attached, are the properties known as Whanarua Bay Site A, the site known as Otama Tohirua, and Tamatari, which is the Waiho Bay boat ramp land. So the settlement will provide for those properties to be transferred to the Whānau Apanui Post-Settlement Governance Entity, what is known as the PSGE. So Post-Settlement Governance Entity will be the administering body for 8 of those reserves, and they'll establish a sort of joint management group that will administer those with the Apanui District Council. And again, that's some of the residue and the historical hangover from how those reserves were originally acquired and how we're trying to get them back and repatriate them back to the iwi. This might not be the final stop for them inside this deed of settlement. It's the big part about the returning of the ownership, and the administration will sort of negotiate as we go along. So the Apanui District Council will be involved in some of that ongoing administration, particularly for the Whanarua Site B Historical Reserve. The site at Tamatari, for example, the Waiho Bay boat ramp, it will be returned in fee simple back to Te Whānau Pararaki. It will have an ongoing allowance in accordance with tikanga for public access, for obvious reasons because of the boat ramp. But also written into that redress is the ability of that hapū to block or stop access in accordance with tikanga when they need to. For example, a rāhui or for other reasons. So there's a notification process and some mechanics that are built into that, but that's seen as an expression of the mana of Te Whānau Pararaki to continue to allow public access, but also to manage that in accordance with their tikanga. There are also within the deed of settlement what we refer to as commercial redress properties. So this is where some existing crown properties or land is being returned to the iwi, or we are using the treaty settlement process to purchase land for the ability to have it returned to the iwi. So primarily inside that category there's two existing crown properties. That's the RSA and section of land at Cemetery Road in Waiho Bay that will transfer to the iwi. There's the right of purchase of another nominated property within a 2-year sort of selection period where the iwi can elect if we want to purchase that bit of land back. And then there's also the right of refusal over 13 crown properties within our iwi exclusive area. So this is not unusual in treaty settlements where the crown can't immediately hand land back, but you can kind of put dibs on it so that when it does look to dispose of it, the iwi is able to be the preferred purchaser to repatriate that land back into the tribal estate. So there's, inside this commercial redress properties aspect of the deed, there's first right of refusal over 13 properties that could come up in the future that the iwi get to say if we want to purchase them before they kind of go out to market. There's reference inside the deed of settlement to whakaari, to White Island, what they call White Island, what we call whakaari. The deed of settlement provides for the Department of Internal Affairs, which are the Crown agency that administer bits of whakaari, that they have to consult with and have regard for the views of Ngā Hapū o Te Whānau Apanui if they conduct a review of the local government sort of administration of whakaari. So again, participation in some of the decision making and the ability to influence that where previously we haven't necessarily had formal recognition or a formal role. Also in regards to whakaari, people will know that it's an active, outstanding claim of Apanui's in regards to our taku taumwana, and that's likely to come up through court process to do with the Marine and Coastal Area Act. In fact, it's already been the subject of some court proceedings that Te Whakatohea put before the court for Marine and Coastal Area and customary marine title. Te Whānau Apanui were acknowledged by that court as having some priority rights in regards to whakaari as consistent with our tribal narrative, and particularly the rights as they're asserted by Te Whānau Te Utu. So that whakaari and the surrounding moana is likely to continue to come up before the courts via the Marine and Coastal Area Act, and Te Whānau Apanui will have, one, we will participate where either iwi assert claims over whakaari, or certainly if they assert claims over any of our marine territory, but also it's set down for 2025 that Te Whānau Apanui would put its entire application in regards to whakaari and other aspects of our taku taumwana in front of the court. So that's still live. There's also specific redress proposed in regards to Whituare Bay at Maraenui. So So the settlement looks to establish a Māori reservation at Whituare, in what they call Whituare Bay / Maraenui Hill, to enable the land to be held in a manner that reflects the ancestral significance and cultural values attributed by the hapū there. So Whituare's got its own, would have its own distinct specialness in regards to its legal status after this deed of settlement. So Toitu Te Oranga Whānui is really about our hapū and iwi ability to provide for the oranga of our mokopuna. And one of the major things getting in our way while we're talking about correcting the historical imbalances and the return of our iwi land base and our territories and stuff like that, one of the big things interrupting or impacting on the oranga of our mokopuna is the interference of Crown agencies into our way of life. So Toitu Te Oranga Whānui sets up and has drafted the opening set of relationship instruments with a whole lot of Crown departments to say, when you come into Te Whānau Apanui, or you're dealing with an Apanui mokopuna, or you're looking to assert some sort of role or function or authority within our iwi, we want you to go through these types of protocols when you do that. And most of the relationship instruments, one, they start with the principles as we've set them out in terms of our sovereignty, in terms of our rangatiratanga, in terms of our principles, our values. They normally front end all of the relationship documents and then go into arrangements where the hapū will sit down with, whether it be in certain situations a minister or chief executive of different government departments, will sit down and will negotiate with them strategic priorities and plans for what they think they're doing in relation to Apanui and what we think or require them to do in relation to Apanui. And once we have negotiated with them strategic plans and strategic priorities, we'll then look to hold each other to account for them. So it's about realigning how we speak to each other and operationalizing part of the treaty arrangement. But those documents will only be as strong as we are at the negotiating table and advocating for our rights going forward. So particularly in the space where we're at with the government at the moment, where they're sort of saying to their government departments, you can step right back off anything to do with treaty compliance. We are going to need to say to them, hey, you've got this agreement in place, which means we jointly set priorities for the Apanui territory or for Apanui mokopuna or for Apanui curriculum or whatever part of it that relationship agreement relates to. We'll need to hold the Crown feet to the fire for treaty implementation going forward. That's not the end of this. This deed of settlement sets up these ongoing relationships going forward. Nothing in these relationship agreements takes away from the original treaty promise and guarantees. Nothing. Nothing can touch that. These are simply our way, our best attempt at the moment to operationalize that as best we can. But we will continue needing to push that out every step of the way. So they're aimed at achieving well-being for the hapū of whānau Apanui and increasing obviously the holistic, spiritual, cultural and physical, environmental, economic, social, political well-being of our iwi. They're about resetting our relationship with Crown departments, particularly those who have misunderstood their obligations to us, and create systems of scaffolding which are agile and able to be adapted depending on what the circumstances our mokopuna face are. So there's one, what we call a kawenata matua over all of the government departments that basically sets the tone and the protocols by which we'll engage, and that's quite strongly worded in regards to Apanui's expectations about the honourable implementation of our treaty, what it means and what it doesn't mean. And then each of the government departments have then got their own bespoke little arrangement that they've negotiated off that. Toitu Te Oranga Whānui is really about our hapū and iwi ability to provide for the oranga of our mokopuna. And one of the major things getting in our way while we're talking about correcting the historical imbalances and the return of our iwi land base and our territories and stuff like that, one of the big things interrupting or impacting on the oranga of our mokopuna is the interference of Crown agencies into our way of life. So Toitu Te Oranga Whānui sets up and has drafted the opening set of relationship instruments with a whole lot of Crown departments to say, when you come into Te Whānau Apanui, or you're dealing with an Apanui mokopuna, or you're looking to assert some sort of role or function or authority within our iwi, we want you to go through these types of protocols when you do that. And most of the relationship instruments, one, they start with the principles as we've set them out in terms of our sovereignty, in terms of our rangatiratanga, in terms of our principles, our values. They normally front end all of the relationship documents and then go into arrangements where the hapū will sit down with, whether it be in certain situations a minister or chief executive of different government departments, will sit down and will negotiate with them strategic priorities and plans for what they think they're doing in relation to Apanui and what we think or require them to do in relation to Apanui. And once we have negotiated with them strategic plans and strategic priorities, we'll then look to hold each other to account for them. So it's about realigning how we speak to each other and operationalizing part of the treaty arrangement. But those documents will only be as strong as we are at the negotiating table and advocating for our rights going forward. So particularly in the space where we're at with the government at the moment, where they're sort of saying to their government departments, you can step right back off anything to do with treaty compliance. We're going to need to say to them, hey, you've got this agreement in place, which means we jointly set priorities for the Apanui territory or for Apanui mokopuna or for Apanui curriculum or whatever part of it that relationship agreement relates to. We'll need to hold the Crown feet to the fire for treaty implementation going forward. That's not the end of this. This deed of settlement sets up these ongoing relationships going forward. Nothing in these relationship agreements takes away from the original treaty promise and guarantees. Nothing. Nothing can touch that. These are simply our way, our best attempt at the moment to operationalize that as best we can. But we will continue needing to push that out every step of the way. So they're aimed at achieving well-being for the hapū of whānau Apanui and increasing obviously the holistic, spiritual, cultural and physical, environmental, economic, social, political well-being of our iwi. They're about resetting our relationship with Crown departments, particularly those who have misunderstood their obligations to us, and create systems of scaffolding which are agile and able to be adapted depending on what the circumstances our mokopuna face are. So there's one, what we call a kawenata matua over all of the government departments that basically sets the tone and the protocols by which we'll engage, and that's quite strongly worded in regards to Apanui's expectations about the honourable implementation of our treaty, what it means and what it doesn't mean. And then each of the government departments have then got their own bespoke little arrangement that they've negotiated off that. So this kawenata matua that sits as this umbrella is basically preserving this mana ki te mana relationship between the hapū of Apanui and the Crown. And it then looks to translate that mana ki te mana relationship into an operationalized version of that mahi ki te mahi. So what are their people on the ground doing? What are our people on the ground doing? How are they going to do that in harmony in a way that advances the well-being of the mokopuna of Apanui or our taiao or whatever it is we're trying to advance. So the joint relationship, that kawenata matua, is between the hapū of Te Whānau Apanui, working as a collective. So between the hapū of Te Whānau Apanui and the Ministry of Justice, Department of Corrections, New Zealand Police, Oranga Tamariki, Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, Ministry of Education, Tertiary Education Commission, Manatū Hauora, that's the Ministry of Health, Te Whatu Ora and Te Aka Whai Ora. We're not sure how they're going to survive the latest round of government reforms, but we've tried to future-proof each of these relationship instruments so that no matter how the Crown moves and shifts, these relationships will follow them. Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, Ministry of Social Development, Ministry for Primary Industries, Waka Kotahi, or the New Zealand Transport Authority, Te Manatū Waka, which is the Ministry of of Transport, Department of Internal Affairs. They are responsible for the National Library, the archives, and as we know, whakaari. Manatū Taonga, which is the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, Te Papa Tongarewa, the Museum of New Zealand, Pauhere Taonga, which is Heritage New Zealand, and Statistics New Zealand. Statistics New Zealand has been a really important relationship agreement for us to land because we need to exercise obviously our own data sovereignty as an iwi to make sure that we're making informed decisions for the benefit of the population. There's a separate relationship negotiated with the Department of Conservation because they've got quite a special position, particularly in regards to the raukumara and some of their functions, that we've needed something a little bit more bespoke from them. The last part of the Toitu Te Orango Ngā Hapū section of the Deed of Settlement is what we call Ngā Pūkoro Hāpai, and that is in relation to the financial or monetary compensation that's been put on the table by the Crown. There is on offer one-off financial redress payment of 30 million in recognition of historic claims. So that's compensation for the historic wrongs that the Crown have acknowledged. And to be clear, that is compensation for historic wrongs. That's not 30 million for Apanui to then spend on getting the Crown to honourably implement the treaty going forward. That the Crown still need to resource that separately, and resourcing we've tried to, as far as possible, anticipate in each of the relationship agreements. But the compensation is for past wrongs. That's for the iwi to make decisions about how that is to be allocated and spent. Also, the deed of agreement inside that Ngā Pūkoro Hāpai will reserve out 5,000 hectares of coastal marine space exclusively for Te Whānau Apanui, where we are able to undertake aquaculture and those sorts of activities. That's a specific reserve of 5,000 hectares of marine space, and Whānau Apanui will also receive a first right of refusal over fishing quota under the Fisheries Act 1996, so that will enable us to purchase fishing quota, but you get a first right of refusal, so you get a priority ability to do that. The last section is Toitu Te Mano o Ngā Hapū, and this is really the whole deed of settlement has been about Te Mano o Ngā Hapū and recognising it, explicitly naming it and making provision for it in different processes going forward. But because the recognition of the mana of Hapū was a key consideration in the negotiations reflected all throughout this deed, there's also some add-on part of the redress that's been negotiated whereby $1.1 million of cultural redress funding will be provided into the deed of settlement. Again, that's for the Hapū working together as a unified iwi. Will make decisions about the way that their cultural redress funding will be allocated. We've said before as an iwi we will look to publish up our legal and political history of Te Whānau Apanui, not just the bits the Crown agreed to, but our own narrative. We published that early in these negotiations, and we would out to the iwi. We would look to refine that and have that published as a proper account out for our mokopuna, and also signposts and that kind of cultural landscape and cultural visibility is something that cultural redress funding is normally allocated to. It will be up to the Hapū of Apanui to make those decisions going forward about the allocation of that fund. Kia ora tātou, just taking you through the registration and ratification / voting process for this historic treaty settlement so you understand how to participate in this decision making. Of course, first is getting yourself upskilled, come to the hui, access the documents and the videos and the whakamarama that we've got available over this next wee while, discuss it with your whānau, hui, all those sorts of things. What we need you to do to actively participate in this vote is to register your name into the Apanui register. The vote is for adult members of our iwi over the age of 18 years at the time of voting. So what you need to do is you need to go to the website, which is www.apanuitaumata.co.nz. That will take you through, there's a button on there for registration. That will take you through step by step everything you need to do to register online. From there, it asks you a series of questions, your name, your address, your email, and those sorts of things, so that voting packs can be sent out to you. And it also asks you whakapapa inside that registration process. There's a reason for that, whānau, and the reason for that is because we need to maintain the integrity of our register. We just can't have every Tom, Dick and whoever coming in onto our tribal register and participating in these collective decisions. Mō nā mokapuna o te whānau Apanui anake tēnei. This is our way to check that, make sure that our register remains tika. So the register itself asks you for a little bit of whakapapa in terms of 2-3 generations back. And then what you need to do from there is you need to select hapū that will verify that whakapapa and just tick the verification of that. That's by no means the only hapū that you whakapapa to or identify with. You don't have to pick a winner and loser between your mum's side, your dad's side, all that sort of stuff. You can still love all your Apanui hapū, but we just need you to tick one box of a hapū that will verify your whakapapa into the register. The most easiest way I can explain that is tick the box of the hapū that knows you, and then they'll be able to go through the verification process. They get it at the other end. They see a whole list of people who have gone onto the iwi register who have ticked their hapū for verifying, and they go, yeah, kei te mōhio, and they make sure that's all verified into the register, right? From there, you're in the process and you will be sent voting packs and you will be able to participate in the vote that's coming up. Now, the voting period is open from the 15th of April to the 13th of May 2024. Now, you need to have your votes in by the 13th of May 2024 for them to be counted into this iwi collective decision. If you're getting close to those dates, close to the 13th of May, there's two ways to vote. You can vote by a postal ballot or you can vote online. What we're recommending to people is that if you're getting close to that end date of the voting period, and we'll start to put some comms out around that time, the safest bet will be to vote online. We're encouraging whānau in Australia to vote online where possible, just so that we can ensure that everybody's vote is going to count right up until the end of the voting period. What happens after that is that's how you get registered to be able to participate in the vote. When the voting period opens, you've got that period of time to make your vote and communicate what your decision is. At the end of the voting period, the independent group that we've got assisting with the elections goes through and makes a report back to us about which of the voting resolutions have passed or not passed. And then they make a report back to ourselves in the Crown. And then we communicate that back to the iwi. From there, there'll be a decision made about whether Apanui proceeds as an iwi to sign this deed of settlement. So that's the how. I hope that's clear. There's some fact sheets available online that you can get. You can run through that again for yourself, and we'll repeat that process at the hui that we are going to be coming out to around the country. Now I want to talk to you about the what you're being asked to vote on. So there's 3 different votes being put to you. There's 3 different resolutions. The first is for this proposed deed of settlement. Do you agree that Te Whānau Apanui should sign up to this deed of settlement for the historic treaty breaches of the Crown? So the first one is about the settlement itself, the deed of settlement. The second resolution is about the PSGE, which is the post-settlement governance entity. Who will manage the settlement and be the administrators of the settlement for the iwi going forward? The proposal is that there's a trust called Te taumata o Ngā Hapū o Te Whānau Apanui Trust, and the trust deed for that is to be made available also on the website. And the resolution being put to you is if you agree that Te taumata o Ngā Hapū o Te Whānau Apanui Trust should be the post-settlement governance entity for this treaty settlement. The next resolution number 3, is about the constitutional documents of that post-settlement governance entity. It's essentially about whether you agree that that post-settlement governance entity should also be the entity recognised by the government for fisheries and aquaculture assets for the iwi. If you agree with that, then you vote yes for that resolution 3 as well. So there's 3 different resolutions, just to clarify. Number 1, the big resolution is about, do you agree with this treaty settlement? Do you vote in favour of this treaty settlement? Number 2, do you agree with the proposed post-settlement governance entity that's been put up? Number 3, do you agree that the post-settlement governance entity that's been put up should also be the mandated iwi organisation for fisheries and for aquaculture? Those are the 3 votes. 1 person, 3 votes into the decision-making, collective decision-making. Once those are all tallied up by the independent election company that's working with us, they will report back, and they will report back to Apanui, and they will report back to the Crown to say if those resolutions have passed or not, or what percentage of the votes has been in favour or against. And from there, that will be reported back to the iwi, obviously, and then a decision will be made as if that threshold is high enough for us to proceed to sign the treaty settlement that's on the table. Like we've said all the way through this, e te whānau, kia koutou te mana, this is up to the iwi to make a collective decision. This is no longer about us as the lawyers or the negotiators or the team that's brought the deed of settlement to this date. Not even really about the hapū chairs at this point. This is about your whānau and your hapū collectives making decisions, all of you participating in the decision. You can say yes or you can say no to each of those resolutions. The only real accountability standard that we've had all the way through these negotiations is whether these things are good enough for our mokopuna. Mo te mana me te tapu o nā mokopuna kei te whai mai. So those are decisions for you to make without interference, I suppose, from any other whakaaro about the negotiators or the process so far. Now we just need you to objectively weigh up. Do you agree with the settlement? Do you agree with the PSGE? Should the PSGE also manage fisheries and aquaculture assets on behalf of the iwi? Follow up for more information on the website. Kia ora. So just talking about special votes and the registration process. So you have up until the 15th of April 2024 to register to participate in this process. If you don't do it by the 15th of April, but you still want to participate in the process, you need to cast a special vote and you need to go through a bit of a different process. What you need to do after the 15th of April is be in direct contact with the company that's running the election process for us, which is Election Services, and they will set you up to be able to cast a special vote. So their phone number is 0800 922 822, and we'll put out their phone numbers, their email, their contact details are available on our website, apanuitaumata.co.nz, and we'll also their information booklets, and we'll make sure that they're made known at hui. If you have settlement or ratification questions between now and then, you should contact Iaro, who are helping us with this project. And if you've got settlement or registration questions that arise between now and the 15th, not related to special voting, then you can contact Iaro, who is the company that's helping us with this ratification phase, and their email is admin@iarau, that's iarau.io. So voting will be open from the 15th of April to the 13th of May 2024. Everyone is eligible for an online vote if you want to vote online. If you elect when you register onto the tribal register to vote by post, then you'll be able to vote by post and you'll just return the prepaid envelope. You need to do that well within the time so that we get your vote and it's counted. There will be also the opportunity, smaller opportunity, for our tinana voting at polling booths. So we are scheduled to have 4 of those, and they'll be on the weekend of the 11th, 12th of May. So just before the voting closes off, we will pānui out the locations and the times of those Atinana polling booths via the Facebook page, and we'll make sure that they are highly publicised where they are if you've left it to the last minute and need to go in and vote in person, you'll be able to do that 11th and 12th in some locations. Kia ora.